Okay, I think good evening to all of you. Right, I'm really enlightened by the fact that there are so many participants who are very much eagerly waiting. So we really do not want to keep you waiting anymore. So today, our discussion is very, I don't need to even say this is timely, because it is still happening now at the very moment that I'm talking. I don't know what is really going on. So today, we are here to discuss about fall of Kabul, whether it is still standing, but we are here to discuss why we say that the Kabul has fallen. And for this discussion, I think we have great two speakers, one in Professor Adimola Abbas. I'm really grateful. Only yesterday I asked him to do this and he agreed. So thank you very much for that. And Madam Vasanta, I say Madam because she is my lecturer, and it is really exciting times here. And I also must say that unfortunately, Sampatsa could not come at the moment. We will start with the program. And firstly, to introduce our very special guest for the day, Professor Adimola Abbas, I will invite Madam Vasanta to give the introduction.
Aibowan and welcome from Sri Lanka. Thank you very much, Mr. Nuwan Akalanka Tilakaratna, who is the master behind the entire program. Last night, he approached me saying our very well respected great scholar, Professor Adimola Abbas, is available for a webinar, because I think all of us are very much eagerly following what is happening in Afghanistan, in Kabul these days. So we are switch on to our YouTube, to our emails, as well as to social media and Googling about to know what is happening in Kabul and in Afghanistan, and the regaining of Kabul by Taliban. I think about some years ago that we were so excited to learn that Taliban were fled away by American-led coalition army. And after many years back, the same thing is happening. And we find some pictures as to how the civilians are trying to flee from Afghanistan. This is not very far or remote. This is in our own region. This is happening in one of the SAARC member state, the 8th member of the SAARC. So I must say that as people who are very much concerned, things beyond the pandemic, we are crippled by pandemic nowadays, but always our speakers are on, our teachers are on to know what is happening across the world. So in this event, all of a sudden when Mr. Akalanka said, well, Professor Adimola Abbas is available, it was such an exciting moment, because I know Professor Adimola Abbas is not a stranger to Sri Lankan international law readers. I find many of my colleagues are here, my undergraduate and postgraduate students are here. My students are aware, whenever I am teaching public international law, one of the first textbooks as well as best textbooks that I recommend you to are credited to Professor Adimola Abbas. Very user-friendly, very enriching content, as well as with non-European context examples. So all of us are privileged to have Professor Adimola Abbas live with us. Personally speaking, it is a dream to me to have this webinar with Professor Adimola Abbas. So I don't know how that I can encapsulate to give you a glimpse of his biography. I think Professor Adimola Abbas will pardon me for selecting such a little to say about him, while that he has so much lot to say about the contribution he has made to international law, international relations, as well as international politics. Professor Abbas was educated at the universities of Lagos, Nottingham, and Cambridge, and holds a PhD in international law and international organizations. He also holds an advanced diploma, magna cum laude, from the Institute of International Public Law, International Relations from Aristotle University in Greece. He was a cabinet member of the Lagos state government and special advisor to the governor on overseas affairs and investment, with broad responsibility for driving investment into Lagos state and liaising with the diplomatic community in Nigeria on behalf of Lagos state government. In his role, Professor Ademola coordinated visits of many high caliber foreign leaders to Lagos state, including President Emmanuel Macron from France, Prime Minister Madame Theresa May from United Kingdom, Queen Maxika from the Netherlands, President Jasim Gok from Germany, Governor General Julie Pitt from Canada, President Haig from Namibia, among others. He also led various Lagos state government teams on investment promotion tours to several countries. Professor Ademola taught law at various British universities and held the position of Professor of International Law and organizations before joining the United Nations University in 2010 as head of program in regional peace and security in 2010. He held visiting positions to several universities, including University of Seville, Spain, Finland, and many other universities in Belgium, London, Geneva Center for Security Policy in Switzerland, and the NATO Senior Defense Course in Rome, Italy. He was head of the African Center for Peace and Security Training in Addis Ababa and head of the Institute for Security Studies Office in Addis Ababa. Also was African Union's first expert on regional mechanism and was European Union expert on capacity building to the African Union. So let me get back to the very important consultancies and his publications. So Professor Ademola has drafted the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, UNICA Model Law on Corruption, and the Memorandum of Understanding between the AU and RECs in Peace and Security adopted in 2008. Some of his seminal published work include Protecting Human Security in Africa, published by Oxford University Press in 2010, his Complete International Law Text, Cases and Materials, published by Oxford University Press, first edition in 2012 and the second edition in 2014, and the Regional Protection of Asylum Seekers and International Legal Perspective, published in Ashgate in 2013, and many more other seminal work can be listed to his credit. Professor Ademola is a regular commentator on international media, including Al Jazeera, and is a solicitor of the Supreme Court of Nigeria and fellow of Cambridge Commonwealth Society. I think we are honored, we are privileged to have you, Professor Ademola. My respect, I think we will be privileged to have you in person in Sri Lanka very soon if the pandemic will help us to have you in. With that, may I give a glimpse of, as a starting point for our discussion today, what happened or what is happening and what will happen in Kabul. So, fall of Kabul and the challenges to international law. I find my friends from many other countries have joined this webinar. I hope that I have not sent any special invitations, but just following what I publish in my social media pages, they have very kindly attended. My students in overseas have attended, and my students in Sri Lanka have attended. So we are very thankful. We are very thankful. We warmly welcome all of you to this very exciting webinar happening. Been in 2 countries. Abbas currently in London, and we are from Sri Lanka. So thank you all. So Mr. Akalanka, can you move the slides? That you find that some of the pictures which are very goes as viral to show what is happening in Afghanistan, in Kabul. as well as I think if you move to the next photograph, it shows this flight AC-17 carrying approximately 614 passengers in one go. You know that when you are going abroad, you might be trying to book a first class or business class seat, or even at least an economic class seat. So you can see how these people are trying to travel out of Afghanistan in fear of their lives. I mean, in the name of protecting their human rights, to protect the values, their right to life, the basic survival needs, their dignity. Why? We have a big issue. Why these people are trying to go like this? We know the Taliban seized power in Afghanistan. You know, again, despite the fact that the US and led invasion of Afghanistan in 2001 ousted those insurgents from power, but they were waiting. I think their war strategy for waiting for nearly 2 decades to get back to their power back. So this is very, very alarming to any country which is under the threat of terrorism or any such insurrection, hands of the insurrectionists, resistant movements. You know, Talibans have no reputation at all. Mr. Akalanka, if you go to the last slide of the demolition of Bahamian Buddhist statues, can you go there? Well, I don't know whether there is any technical error, but can you move to the last? Well, that in Sri Lanka, many of us have been Buddhist, that we know how much important for us these Buddhist cultural symbols. So not only to us, these are World Heritage sites. These were recognized by UNESCO as a World Heritage owed by all of us in the world. So those were demolished. So with that, Taliban's, I think I wish to show you some of the books you might have read with interest. 1,000 Splendid Suns, authored by the well-renowned author Khalid Hosseini, as well as the Kite Runner. All these are, you know, the very widely read classic fictions. Though those are fictions, those gave us some live pictures of how dreadful the Taliban regime was, what kind of human rights were under depression, how women, children, innocent people, civilians were treated. So then why that all of us are so much worried about the fall of Kabul and fled away of the US-led interim government president and the capture of the palace, and how these Talibanis were freely behaving ins and outs in Kabul city and elsewhere. So with that, I think that it is very opportune for us to begin the discussion now in proper. Thank you for the opportunity given.
Right. Thank you very much, madam, for that wonderful introduction into the background. So we will now go for the discussion itself. And now the floor will be open for the two speakers. So I'll be putting questions, and we also welcome questions from the participants. You can always put your questions in the chat box and we will read it out. And in case if you really do want to ask a direct question, you are also welcome to do that as well. So the first question I'm going to put to Professor Abbas is that now we all know what is happening in Afghanistan, but how can we see this situation from an international legal perspective?
Well, good afternoon. I'm calling from London. Good afternoon, everyone, wherever you are. Thank you so much. First and foremost, I think my biggest thank, let me start with that, goes to just the last speaker, Mr. No One. who has been, he did say that we only had a chat yesterday when he invited me to do this, but he's been on my case for about 3 years now, or 4, to do a talk, and I'm hugely honored to accept. And hey, thank you so much for everybody who has turned up for this. That's remarkably humbling. Humbling also because I'm in the UK now, only came in about 4 days ago. I'm in the quarantine. So you are the first faces of human beings I'm saying in this quantity in the last 4 days or 5 days. So that is a great opportunity for me. And of course, to Professor Wasanta and all the colleagues from the University of Colombo, thank you so much. Look, your question is, how do we situate what is happening today in Afghanistan within international law? Just let me try to bring a bit of structure into this. My specialty is largely, I'm a public international lawyer with a particular focus on the law of armed conflict and use of force, which we call in international law, Heos in Bellum, and also collective security law, which is rightly square within this. And Professor Wasanta, thankfully, she focuses on international humanitarian law, which is the other side, which is the conduct of war, otherwise called Heos in Bello. So we actually cover the 2 broad spectrums of laws that govern armed conflict. So I'm going to be looking at what is going on in Afghanistan today, largely from where we are coming from, basically. You remember how we got here, the Taliban, well, they've been there, since early 90s, after the Soviets, fled in 1979, after the collapse, they moved in, and so on and so forth. We know the internal fighting and everything that happened within the Mujahideen's camp in those days, which gave birth to the Taliban, and then they overthrew the government in 1994. They began to rule Afghanistan until 9/11, September 11, 2001 happened. That was when they hit target in the United States. Right. The first thing is the US went in. On that, don't forget, US went in what we call, in its exercise of the right of collective self-defense. Now, you're going to pardon me and forgive me, because it's a seminar in international law, where I'm going to bore you a bit with a bit of international law provisions, UN Charter and what have you. But that is what we are dealing with, basically. States have always had the right to defend themselves. We call it self-defense if an armed attack occurs against them. Now, when the US was attacked in 2001, the question that arose was whether there was an armed attack against the US. And that was simply because when the UN Charter was drafted in 1944 to 1945, those who put that provision, which is Article 51 of the UN Charter, in the UN Charter, they were not thinking about attacks caused by non-state actors. At that point in time, Al-Qaeda attacked the US. Al-Qaeda was not a government in Afghanistan. They were a non-state actor. They were a terrorist group, for which was harbored and accommodated by and in Afghanistan. So the question for us international lawyers was, will the US be right to be responding to an attack by a non-state actor under the UN Charter? Because Article 51 only contemplated in 1945 state actors, that is when a state attacks another state. The answer was simple and straightforward. Yes, US could do that, because although Al-Qaeda was not a state actor, was not in government then, it was protected by the Taliban, which was in government. It was protected by the state of Afghanistan. So therefore, under the doctrine of imputability, which we have in law of contract and international law and other types of laws as well, the crime committed by the Al-Qaeda operating from within Afghanistan was imputable on the state of Afghanistan. So those crimes for the purposes of international law will be deemed to be crime committed by Afghanistan. That was the legal basis the US could go against Afghanistan at that point in time. And for international lawyers and international law students here, you will remember the Caroline case 1837 between the UK and US. And also you remember Nicaragua case. That is just to talk about how we got in. Now, but when US was going into Afghanistan, it went under the NATO alliance. The North Atlantic Treaty was adopted in 1945. And Article 5 of the NATO Treaty says that an attack on one member of NATO states is an attack on all members of NATO states. So an attack on the US at that point in time was deemed to be an attack on all members of NATO, which was why it was NATO that went to Afghanistan with the US in 2001. Fast forward 20 years after. Reality happened. The US withdrew. Don't forget that May this year, I beg your pardon, sometime last year, Donald Trump signed an agreement, reached an agreement with the Taliban that the US will withdraw by May this year. Of course, he thought he was going to be in power, but anyway. So when Joe Biden came in, he inherited that agreement with the Taliban. However, he couldn't realize May, and he had to delay the protest until now. Now, we've seen what has happened in the last few days in Afghanistan. The, literal and metaphorical fall of Kabul and the country itself, from orderliness to utter chaos that we witnessed at the airport. Your question, Noan, is how then do we situate this in international law? Now, I've just traced the story from how we got to where we are, but we must ask ourselves a question. To situate this within international law today, we have to ask a simple question. Why did the US and its allies go into Afghanistan? From my mind, the simple answer was the US went to Afghanistan to decimate the capability of Al-Qaeda or any other terrorist organization that was operating from within that country to be able to attack the US or any of its allies again. That was the reason why the US went to Afghanistan. So was that achieved? Of course. US claimed that was achieved. Al-Qaeda was utterly decimated or scattered, if you like. And the golden image of Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, 10 years ago, was terminated by the United States forces. So at that point in time, the world would be right to conclude that, well, US went into Afghanistan to decimate a terrorist group, had done that, why didn't he leave? Now, here's the trick. If the US had left Afghanistan at that point in time and that collapse had taken place, we will have turned back to condemn the US that the US cut and run in Afghanistan, which is what it was doing before. It will go into a country, do whatever it wants to do, and get out quickly and leave the mess for those in the country to clear. US didn't do that this time around. US stayed back in Afghanistan. The question is, why did then US stay back in Afghanistan? Now, I am not going to go into the political reasons people have talked about oil and this and that. I am not concerned about all those. As international legal scholars, we must address ourselves to facts, not rumors and fictions. I'm not saying those rumors and fictions cannot be right in political parlance. That is not what we are dealing with here, squarely speaking. But US stayed in that country practically to help the country develop its capabilities to be able to govern itself. As they say, good for democracy. Over the last 20 years, US claimed to have spent over $1 trillion and they trained 300,000 Afghan strong soldiers to be able to withstand the Taliban. How many thousands of lives were lost by America and its allies? How many civilians were wiped out? So we will have thought that 20 years on, Afghanistan will be in a very strong position to be able to confront whatever gulag that the Taliban threw to them. That did not happen. What we saw a few days ago, which actually surprised the Taliban themselves, was a most expeditious, the fastest takeover by any rebel that you can ever see anywhere in probably recent human history. Of course, we know President Biden came out to justify, and he did have some compelling logics if you listen to his account. And I think you can summarize why US left Afghanistan, to my mind, in two ways. US realized that when they went to Afghanistan in 2001, the intention will never have been to remain in Afghanistan forever. I mean, not 2001 was not 1945, in which after the Second World War, you bifurcated Germany into two, East and West Germany, and you called on the left-leaning and right-leaning countries, communist and capitalist countries, to come and take over the country forever. No, that was not going to happen. US realized that. So that was one extreme that US could never achieve. They could never stay in Afghanistan forever. But the other extreme is that US also could not cut and run, because that would be disastrous. So US tried to find a middle way. A middle way was to help Afghanistan build itself to be able to defend itself. That did not happen. So then the question for us is, why didn't that happen? Now, that is a billion-dollar question that I'm sure most of you are better informed about it than me. But from an international law point of view, it is clear to my mind that we are still grappling with things that we do not know in international law. we are still grappling with how can we ensure that when a country or a coalition of countries goes into a state, into another country, to undertake certain actions, be it self-defense or collective security under the UN Charter, whatever they go to do, they stay focused on that. And what happens when that country departs? The answer is out there. The jury is still out. Is it that that country or the coalition of the country that goes into a country like Afghanistan should have reached an agreement with the United Nations to be able to have an agreement so the coalition and the UN could work together, that when that country is exiting, the UN could step in? That is $1 billion question. Or should we be thinking that, look, the reason we have regional organizations under Chapter 8 of the UN Charter is that they will play a complementarity role to the United Nations system itself. What happened to ASEAN? What happened to regional organizations in that particular part of the world, Afghanistan and other countries existing? Can such organizations like ASEAN and co have stepped into to fill the void when US and other countries were departing? Should the US and its allies have made a deal with regional organizations to make sure that by the time they're exiting, they will come in and fill the gap? These are just questions I'm throwing out there. I wish we had a crystal ball that we can stare at and say, this is the appropriate answer. So I think that is how we can situate this in international law. We have to look at where we are coming from. What reason did the US have and its ally to go into Afghanistan in the first place? Did they accomplish that reason? Why did they stay longer than they should have stayed? And under what circumstances could they have exited in the way they have exited a few days ago? I will stop there for now.
Yes, well, I guess that really kind of gives a holistic view as to, what is really happening there. And I think that, without answering the question, I guess that really, makes us think what is going to be the law in the future that when such situations arise. That is a great explanation, Professor. Thank you for that question. And now I would like to invite Madam Vasanta. Now, we all know that her expertise lies in humanitarian law. So we know that many of the atrocities are now, they are beginning to happen. Right now, the Taliban are trying to impose many laws which we may think are very much unfair. So, ma'am, from an international humanitarian perspective, can you explain about the applicable law and the situation in Afghanistan?
Thank you for your question, as well as the explanatory groundbreaking notes by Professor Abbas. I find when I see the chat box, our participants are having a lot of queries with regard to whether Talibanis can be recognized as non-state actors. And I saw some questions are about how that if Talibanis were recognized as at least a de facto government or de jure government, what kind of international law would be applied? That shows us the momentum created among the participants about the very important international law aspects associated with the fall of Kabul back to the hands of Taliban. So if I come to the issue from use below perspective, as Professor Abbas said, so we are talking about use ad bellum as well as use in bello. So we can talk about the laws relating to use of force and international law implementation, as well as from protecting humanity in times of an armed conflict. So moving to humanitarian law perspectives, we know humanitarian law is the legal regime that attempts to strike a balance between military necessity and humanity in times of an armed conflict. Armed conflicts are categorized in numerous ways, but under international humanitarian law, we understand armed conflicts are predominantly categorized as falling into either international armed conflict situations or non-international armed conflict situations. So this classic situation of Afghanistan time to time offers us these varied classified types of an armed conflict. For an example, when Afghanistan was under US-led coalition, the armed attack, so then we find it is between two or more sovereign states. Therefore, that can be categorized as an international armed conflict situation. But with the withdrawal of US armed forces, as very lucidly explained by Professor Abbas, you know, that is a political decision by the hegemonic power, the US. We understand the hegemonic powers such as the US or Russia or such powerful countries that they do things to gain something back. Spending millions, trillions of dollars, they, you know, send those armies to Afghanistan in the name of restoring peace, harmony, humanity. But after 2 decades, we don't find whether the cure is better than the disease. I think that is one of the great scholar, Antonio Amato, says, you know, the cure, the remedy should not be worse than the disease. But we could not see any good happen to Afghanistan during this invasion. Now, we know as a country which was affected by 3 decades of an armed conflict, you know, having entered a foreign army to restore in the name of restoration of peace, harmony, and humanity. And if they are to go back, keeping the same scars, keeping the same problems, and again inviting us to address the matter from a different perspective of humanitarian law, I think the same old problems come in new names. Now, the situation is almost like a non-international armed conflict situation because no foreign army involves. Now we find again an anarchical situation, even no fight at all, you know, because the well-trained, supposed to be well-trained, well-invested, you know, interim government armed forces, America thought that the training given would have, you know, given the required strength, the morale, as well as power to face with any kind of such insurrection attack coming from Talibanis or Al-Qaeda or whatever terrorist movement. But we find what kind of a morale the armed forces were given. So they are kept silent. They kept their arms down. The president fled away. You know, so this is now an anarchical situation. So now it is almost in the hands of a terrorist group. So now we have to think about the violations from a human rights perspective, from a humanitarian law perspective, as well as I'm sure in the near future, we have to address this from an international criminal law perspective, because there would be many crimes that we all know. Geneva Conventions of 1949, Hague Conventions and Hague Regulations, as well as 1977 Protocol 1 and Protocol 2. Those are the applicable laws apart from customary international law principles and case law jurisprudence. So these well-established legal principles tell us about what those violations or grave breaches in times of an armed conflict. So it could happen in the name of a grave breach or violations of Common Article 3, which is applicable to a non-international armed conflict situation, whatever the name could be. Those are very serious damages to the humanity, violations of principle of proportionality. You cannot target people who are not directly participating in hostilities. The civilians, the women, the children, the injured people who are not take part in hostilities. Even the soldiers, former soldiers, who are now kept down their arms, who are named to be Odikomba. So their lives must be protected. So that is one of the responsibility is now lies with the Taliban, whether that they are going to play the same game or whether that as they try to portray, whether they are going to be civilized or whether they are going to, you know, to correct themselves. I find some of the ambassadors in Russia and many other countries, they have shown some glimpse of hope to show, well, that Talibanis would do now something better. You know, we don't know how better, what better means. So there are no any less standards than what is established in international law. international law requires the civilized behavior of the nations as well as the ruling regime. So I saw one a student or one participant, I'm sorry, has very rightly asked about the question whether we can recognize them as non-state actors if they portray themselves continue to be as terrorists or groups of such insurrectionists. So how can we offer a situation like Professor Abbas will explain this further, a belligerent, the situation of belligerency. So it is something very near to that you are fighting with a similar armed actor, similar to a state party. So to reach to that situation, I mean, IHL very well explained that even to accept resist the members of a resistance movement, they should carry their arms openly. They should be commanded by a person who is responsible for the subordinates what they are doing. They should be distinguishable even from a distance. The most importantly, they should follow the rules and customs of law. So until such time they don't follow rules and customs of law, that is used in BELO or international humanitarian law, we don't know whether they should be accepted as parties to an armed conflict, who should be given any kind of recognition or humanitarian treatment. So these are some of the very crucial matters that we are facing with. Even with regard to 1933 Montevideo Convention rights and duties of states, we understand, I mean, now we are going to celebrate the centennial century of having this in some about 12 or 13 years. So it is rather outdated, but still it provides some kind of a criteria for the recognition of states. So whether Taliban, I don't know how to say that, Talibanese, I say, if they will establish a government legally or illegally, so the entire international community will have to address that problem, to answer this problem, whether we are going to accept them at least as a de facto government, because they need to work with them. They have to protect the people under their hands. The people who are trying to flee from those countries, or the people who would manage to flee and be refugees in other countries until that they will be granted the asylum duly. So these are some of the compelling problems that would occur in the days to come, especially the human rights issues, the protection, the basic needs, human dignity. So all this will have to be dealt with the application of international law in broadly and specifically international human rights law and international humanitarian law. I think that we can discuss all these things in the questions and other deliberations to happen.
Yes, thank you very much, madam, for that great explanation. Again, now, when we learn about international law, one of the things that we hear is the role of the Security Council. And we really think that, it has this overarching power where it can intervene, it can take decision, and it can make things happen. So in this situation, what is the role of the UN Security Council, and why don't we see much, prompt action from them, Professor Adimola? Yes, Professor, I think you are on mute, right?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me now?
Professor.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Professor, we can hear you, Professor.
Yeah, thank you very much, Noan. Before I answer that question, or attempt to answer the question, let me just spend a couple of minutes to add to what Professor just said now, because a couple of some questions have popped up from our listeners, and thank you very much for your questions. I think Professor has already dealt with the question of the application of international humanitarian law to non-state actors. Of course, all the additional protocols, Geneva Conventions, 1949, and so on and so forth. Don't let me regurgitate all those. But somebody asked a question about whether the Taliban government will be recognized under Montevideo Convention. Let us be clear, there's a distinction between the recognition of states and recognition of government. Whenever we are talking about recognition, we have to be very, very careful in the sense that you can recognize a state without recognizing the government. That's the first thing. Afghan is a state, it's recognized in international law. Now, the question of whether we recognize its government, which is by Taliban, is a different question, which actually is governed by different considerations in international law than the considerations or the criteria that govern recognition of state. Recognition of government sometimes is more of a political consideration than law itself, whereas recognition of state is more routed in legal norms and principles. I'm sure you know. But what is important is, again, we must be careful not to, I think we tend to probably conflate, I won't say confuse, we tend to conflate the Taliban with terrorist groups. Taliban is a brutal organization. The Taliban is repressive within Afghanistan. It's not being, so to say, formally classified as a terrorist organization. The government run by the Taliban in the past harbored terrorist organizations. So whereas you could impute the activities of Al-Qaeda and what have you in those days on the Taliban, we cannot jump to conclusion to do that now. The Taliban is a sector that is coming to a government. And the question is whether it will be recognized. China came out a couple of days ago with Russia that, they will look at activities by those governments to see whether they are going to recognize them or not. And that is because recognizing a government is different from recognizing a state. It is a political consideration. So, look at it when the State of Israel was created. You saw a bit of politics in terms of whether the state will recognize and who doesn't recognize it. But the test in international law, in terms of recognizing the government, what is important is whether that government, whether you like it or not, is exercising a de facto or de jure control over the particular country or over that particular community. And this is not left to our imagination. In Nicaragua case, the ICJ made a clarification of that, and international lawyers will understand that, about how the ICJ laid down the rules and what we have to look at when you're looking at whether a country is exercising de jure or de facto. So you can be a de jure, you can be a de jure government, you can be elected democratically into a particular government, you can be put in charge of a country and not exercise powers of government. And you may have a group that is not elected, that is not even there in government, but is exercising effective control over the country. The question is, who is recognized? If you apply the distinction between de facto and de jure, that particular group will be recognized as being in government. And that was applied in Nicaragua case, with the activity of the Contras, in Nicaragua, which under the protection and the sponsorship of the US, and so on and so forth. So I just thought we should make that kind of clarification very, very clear. A lot will depend on what countries make of the activities of the Taliban. The Taliban are doing a lot of PR, public relations now, that, they are going to be good guys, they have matured over the years, they are going to be better, but the jury is out. But don't let's kid ourselves here. At the end of the day, it comes down to certain countries at the end of the day. Most likely, I would place my bet on China and Russia recognizing the Taliban faster than most Western countries will do. But the Western countries like the US, UK, they are in a catch-22 situation. It's a question of damn you do, damn you don't. If they do not recognize the Taliban as a government, then they have a problem in terms of staying with the commitment to still protect level of some protection on people who are in Afghanistan or ordinary Afghans who need protection. Somebody raised a question about the responsibility to protect. That is a critical responsibility that is laid at the feet of the United Nations system. So I just thought I would make all those initial clarifications before we go further. Now, to your question, Security Council. Now, that is a huge and $1 billion question. What role can the Security Council perform, and why haven't we seen that so far? I think in my private chat, sometimes, I think I've told no one also in the past, sometimes we judge international law by its failure, not its successes. In those days, they would say international law was a failure, international law was not effective and this and that. People tend to criticize international law. They tend to judge international law based on its failure, not on its successes sometimes. Wherever you are today, international law is at work, to put it in a very, basal way, basically. Security Council has been working. Don't forget, if you go back to 2001, all the resolutions, of course, when the US went and its ally went to Afghanistan, they eventually wrote Security Council to seek authorization they did not need the authorization of Security Council to go into Afghanistan because they were exercising their right under Article 51 of the UN Charter, collective self-defense, which they had. But nonetheless, they informed the Security Council, which of course, Security Council did not authorize the action because it didn't have to authorize it, but it confirmed in its resolution that indeed it is the right of the state to exercise the right of collective self-defense. So Security Council has been engaged in Afghanistan for a long time. But there are certain dynamics we need to understand when we're talking about Security Council here. Security Council is dominated by its permanent members of Security Council, 5 of them, and we all know them: France, Britain, US, USSR, and China. China, USSR, today, China and Russia are going to be on one side, predictably. UK, US, and France are going to be on the other side. That makes the work of Security Council incredibly difficult and tedious. Now, Security Council has the responsibility under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter to afford collective security in international law to any society that is in need of it. And we've seen a panoply of activities by Security Council. Look at Iraq, 1990. Look at Resolution 678. Look at Libya, Resolution 748. Look at Sierra Leone, 1271 and 1270. You can replicate all the resolutions where the Security Council authorized nations cooperating with the United Nations to go into a country to maintain peace and security. In international law, as we all know, the phrase to maintain peace and security is a euphemism for saying go and use force to maintain peace in that country. Now, but when US was attacked, it was attacked by a non-state actor. So as I said, the biggest challenge for the Security Council was whether to authorize an action against non-state actor. The US was protected at that point in time because US had to go on its own anyway in collective security. Now, whatever action the Security Council needs to take, as we all know today, so far their enforcement actions, they must go through the permanent members of Security Council, who have, it is much easier for the needle, or for the camel to go through the needle eye than for the 5 members of Security Council, permanent members, to agree with one another. We all know that. In a long, long time, it was just on a particular occasion that all the 5 members agreed on the use of force in a particular place. It doesn't happen overnight. So we cannot really count on Security Council at the moment that it matters most. It happened. Let me use examples of West Africa. When Liberia erupted into crisis in 1997, the first thing that the states in West Africa did was to call on Security Council to come and undertake enforcement action in Liberia. What did the UN say? The Security Council said, it was Javier Pérez de Cuellar, who was the Secretary General there. He said, what is happening in Liberia is an internal matter for the Liberians. And that is only countries that are going to be affected by the activities of a particular country that should first be the responding countries. That was the foundation of the formation of the ECOWAS monitoring group that became ECOMOG, which went to Liberia to do peacekeeping and eventually went to Sierra Leone. So the Security Council has a record of ceding its responsibility to regional organizations when it is convenient for it to do so. The question is, in Afghanistan, there was no effective, and I don't know any effective organization that it could cede this responsibility to do that today. And the dynamics in Afghanistan are a bit different. Today, we are faced with a system that has failed in Kabul, but there's a government in power, don't forget. The Taliban is a government, whether we like it or not, is a government. And I'm very happy when I was monitoring UK the debate in the House of Parliament in England, just about 30 minutes before this program started. Boris Johnson, the UK Prime Minister, made it clear that let's kid ourselves. There was a regime change in Afghanistan. We must accept that. The Taliban is a government today in Afghanistan. And being a government, the Security Council cannot go in to go and use force. Against what? Because of what? They've just come into power. They haven't done anything that threatens international peace and security. You remember what I'm talking about here, Article 39 of the UN Charter. Before the Security Council can do anything, can authorize the use of force in the UN Charter, the first thing the Security Council must do is to determine that whatever is going on in a particular country constitutes a threat to international peace and security. Today, people fleeing Afghanistan does not constitute a threat to international peace and security from within the purview of the UN Charter. They are escaping for their life. We haven't seen evidence that the Taliban started killing people already. If that has started, then that's a different ballgame altogether. Then the Security Council must up its gear to go and protect them. But then the question is, must we wait until that happens? Well, look, there was a sudden withdrawal by the US from Afghanistan. Another government has taken place. So there was bound to be a chaos. We are not happy about the chaos that is going on, but legally, it does not give the Security Council any authority to go into Afghanistan to do anything today. What is it going to do there? Peacekeeping? No. Enforcement action against who? That cannot happen today. But the question is, what role then should the Security Council play in Afghanistan in the future? That is a very important question. Now, it comes down to how the Taliban are going to rule that country. We can begin to predict certain things to happen. Number one, there is likely to be the resurgence of terrorist activities within Afghanistan. And I dare say, pretty much quickly, the world might find itself back in the pre-2001 situation that the world was in Afghanistan. That is to say, we are likely to see an emergence of many terrorist organizations back in Afghanistan. Now, if that happens, then there is legitimacy for the international community under the umbrella of the United Nations Security Council to authorize any action to deal decisively with such terrorist activities. Don't let us forget, in so many resolutions, the Security Council has admitted that activities by terrorist organizations constitute a threat to international peace and security. So our hope, and something tells me that hope will not be too long before it will mature. Our hope is that the Taliban will take certain steps that will begin to threaten the international peace and security of the Afghan people. Now, but that is when you're talking about the collective security power of the Security Council under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. But we do not need to wait before that happens. There's what we call responsibility to protect. The Security Council must be able to rally states around. The only challenge we have, and again, that goes to the root of Security Council's challenges, is that the countries that really matter when it comes to motivating or mobilizing United Nations Security Council resources are the same countries that are playing, games in Afghanistan. That is to say, US, that is to say, UK, that is to say, Russia, that is to say, China, and throw it in by a long shot, France. So the question we should be asking ourselves is, will the United States and United Kingdom, having spent over $2 trillion, 20 years of almost absolute errant nonsense at the end of the day, having lost thousands of people, will be willing, even if they are able to, will be willing to be engaged or to allow the United Nations Security Council to be effectively engaged in Afghanistan? My straightforward answer is no. Something tells me, and I hope I'll be proved wrong, that it's likely that these countries look away. The United Nations Security Council will look away when pogrom will start in Afghanistan. And I hate to say it, pogrom is likely to happen. The Taliban are the strongest they will ever be, and they've ever been. They can look back and say, we defeated the Soviets in 1979. We defeated the Americans and the Allies in 2001. Who is there to stop us? And for me, that is the game. That is the critical thing we have to face. So the Taliban is likely to come and play dirty. They are going to repress women, no question about that. They're going to make men grow beards longer than my own, like, whatever dimension, there's no question about that. They're going to deal decisively with children, no question about that. They're going to be very, very repressive, given their record. All this whitewash and the hogwash they're showing, I don't buy it. And the world knows. But you see, this is a danger. The Western society, the Western countries under the United Nations system, that the Security Council, is going to buy into what the Taliban are saying. They're going to accept as an article of faith that the Taliban has turned a new leaf and they'll be better behaved. You know why they do that? Because not to accept that is to force them to make sure they hold the Taliban accountable. They don't want to do that. 1994 in Rwanda, the United Nations system knew that genocide was about to be committed in Rwanda. In fact, a serving member of the UN mission in Rwanda sent consistent message to New York that pogrom was going to happen, that genocide was going to be committed. The United Nations system under Kofi Annan looked away. They did not authorize a use of force. There was a peacekeeping operation, and peacekeeping operation, we call it Chapter 6 of the UN Charter. Peacekeeping operations do not have authority to use enforcement action in any country. So if you watch the video of Rwandan genocide, you will see UN peacekeepers making barbecue on one side of the road, while Interamways, those who are going to use force to kill almost 1 million of their own people, were on the other side of the road. In between them was the unseen force of international law. That might still happen. I hope it doesn't, but if my gut feeling is right, it might happen in Afghanistan. There will be a lot of repression in Afghanistan, and Security Council might look away. You know why? Because the same countries that will have motivated Security Council were the same countries that ran out of Afghanistan and left Afghanistan and Afghan people to suffer the fate. So really, to my mind, the role the Security Council can play in Afghanistan in the future is going to be very, very palliative. They are going to adopt a lot of resolutions in which they'll be calling on the government of Afghanistan to respect human rights, to respect fundamental human rights, to make sure they deal with people very well in a very nice way and this and that. They know very well that those things are just hogwash, they just whitewash. That is the truth. Now, let me stretch that question a little further. So if Security Council is not working, what should we do? Should we fold our hands? Should we rely on the internal forces of Afghanistan to be able to? No, the Taliban is in power today. The Taliban forces are not going to do anything contrary to what their political leadership direct them to do. So you cannot rely on the Taliban to maintain that. The Afghan forces capitulated. $1 trillion was spent on it, 300,000 of them, but it capitulated. Make no mistake, there were brave people, brave soldiers in that country who fought. But the pace, the speed with which the National Army of Afghanistan surrendered to the Taliban raises the question in the first place, whether there was a will to fight or whether you can use $1 trillion to buy the will to fight in a country. The US has learned today that you can never buy the will to fight. You can pay trillions of dollars, you can do everything, but the will to fight resides in the people. If they don't have the will to fight themselves, there's little you can do. So those who are hard on the US must realize that fact. The same president who in June and July, that's Ghani, who was in the US assuring the international community that the army was strong enough to repel, left that country Iran. This afternoon, he got to United Arab Emirates. So what that tells us is that we are in a very serious situation in which we are almost helpless. International law here is almost helpless because international law can only be galvanized today under the collective security machinery, Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which is spearheaded by Security Council. Security Council dominated by 5 members, 3 or 4 of whom ran out of Afghanistan. So what does that leave us? I'm going to answer that question by taking a step back to what we did in West Africa. Now, permit me, I'm using that example because that formed the basis of my thesis, PhD thesis in the UK in 1999 to 2002. I saw the hopelessness of Security Council. I saw the non-readiness of Security Council to deploy forces into countries that some permanent members are not eminently interested in. There was little interest of United States or United Kingdom in Liberia when Liberia erupted in 1997. But Nigeria had a lot of interest being a West African country that eventually hosted hundreds of thousands of refugees from Liberia. And Nigeria galvanized the Economic Committee of West African States, a small group in West Africa, to go and intervene in Liberia. That was when Chapter 8 of the UN Charter received a very interesting interpretation. And your humble person here humbly contributed to that with my PhD thesis. And at that point in time, I wrote a whole thesis in the UK on the need to decentralize the collective security system of the UN Charter. What was my argument in my thesis? It's very simple. That whereas the UN Charter says that whenever there is a conflict, regional organizations must take authority from the Security Council to go and intervene in that country. I went for a different interpretation. I said, yes, that is what Chapter 8 of the UN Charter has said. But don't let us forget, states had the power to defend themselves before the United Nations was formed in 1945. What that then means is that states gave the power to the United Nations in 1945 so that the UN will protect them. It is like the contrarian theory. I have my power, but I surrender my power to the king to defend me. So the question I asked in my thesis is, what if the king refuses to defend me? Don't I defend myself? So what if the Security Council fails to protect state? Shouldn't states be able to organize and then protect themselves? And that was why I was asking in my PhD thesis for a reinterpretation of Chapter 8 of the UN Charter to enable states in a particular region that will be affected by a conflict to be the first to intervene and then seek authorization from Security Council. That precisely happened in Sierra Leone. ECOWAS went and intervened in Sierra Leone, and Security Council adopted Resolution 1271 to retroactively authorize that authorization. That is fine. We are all lawyers, and most of us are lawyers here. We know in law of contract, if I go out, vicarious liability, if I go out and I do, if I have authorities ABC from my principal and I work on his behalf, but when I'm working, I discover that EFG will be necessary and I exercise EFG, provided my principal adopt those activities I did under EFG, that would be retroactive authorization. That is as good as if I had it in the first place. What am I saying in essence? I have made it clear today, I hope I have made it clear now that we cannot rely on the Taliban or the Afghan forces to protect ordinary Afghanistan, ordinary Afghans from the disaster that is bound to happen. They cannot protect them from the repression of human rights by the same people who are going to repress their human rights. We cannot rely on Security Council today to be able to deploy muscular active enforcement operation into Afghanistan to protect its people. What I'm saying in essence is that regional organizations in that part of the world, they have a critical role to play because they will be India, Pakistan, and they will be the countries to be badly affected if those disasters begin to happen in Afghanistan. So for me, I think we need to look at what the role international law is likely to play. We're talking about the challenges to that particular role, which I think I identified a few of them within the UN Charter here. And to begin to think, look, Chapter 7 is not the end. If Chapter 7 of the UN Charter will not work under the UN Charter, let's go to Chapter 8 of the UN Charter and look to regional organizations. So we'll be looking towards powerful countries in that area to be able to, let's kid ourselves. The Organization of American States, OAS, was extremely effective in the Latin American region in the 50s and 60s. The OAS was there even before the United Nations itself was born. That organization was very effective in the Americas in those days. And we know how the UN system actually bought into what the OAS was doing. For those who are very familiar about the drafting of the UN Charter. So what I'm saying is that don't let us limit the role of international law in Afghanistan to what the United Nations Security Council might do. Don't bet your life on that. Go beyond that and look into what regional organizations in that particular area are likely to do. And they are likely because they understand, and the advantages of regional organizations is that, A, they are very propinquitous. They are very close to the seat of the activity. They're very close to the country, Afghanistan. They're very close in terms of culture, in terms of language, in terms of tradition of that particular country. All those countries like India, Pakistan, and Co, they are closer to Afghanistan. They are closer to the Afghan people than US, UK, France, and other countries in far-flung places in the world. I rest here for now.
Well, thank you so much, Professor. I believe that was it in itself a reinterpretation of the Security Council, I believe. So I think that you cleared many of the doubts that we had and actually to the role of the security and what it can do and when it can do it. So then the next question would be, Professor, now, as you mentioned, since US went in pursuit of their right to self-defense, and to be frank, they went into kill Osama bin Laden, I believe. That was their ultimate target. But that happened in 2011. How could we justify their presence after 2011 in Afghanistan?
Yes, thank you, Nuwan. I think I alluded to that earlier on. And that was when I was talking when I first started. And I said, let's look at the reason why the US and its allies went into Afghanistan initially. That was, as you've rightly pointed out, that was principally to decimate the capacity of Al-Qaeda in that country and to take out the Taliban, which was affording affording Al-Qaeda its protection in that country. And they achieved that, you are right. And I said the climax of that was the termination of Osama bin Laden in 2011. But then I did ask the question, then why did the US and its ally stay beyond 2011? And I think the answer to my mind is that the US, I would suspect, did not want to be accused of cutting and running again, which it always did in the past. Go into a country, overthrow a government or do something like that and then run and leave the mess for people to clear. So the US thought, look, let's wait around. Let's help Afghanistan to install a democratic government. Let's help them build their capacity of their army, of their institutions, to be able to, deal with this country themselves, to be able to govern themselves better, to be able to, afford their people democratic governance. Now, there's nothing wrong in that. And I am not being naive here, because I'm sure most of our listeners will know a lot of other reasons. I said those other reasons are political reasons. People have said it's because of oil. They have said it's because of contract. Look, as an international lawyer, I don't worry my head too much about those. It's just like some people asking questions whether COVID is man-made or not human-made. I said, look, the most important thing we should be focusing our mind is how do we deal with the pandemic? Whether it is man-made or human-made, or it is natural, it is unnatural, the truth is it is decimating humanity. Let's focus our energy on dealing with it, why we are not losing sight of investigating why it came in the first place. But don't let us focus all our effort into why it came in the first place. So I think US realized in 2001, when it went into Afghanistan, that this was not 1945. After the end of the Second World, that you divide a belligerent country like Germany into two and say, look, Russia, you manage the East Germany, US and co, you manage West Germany, you manage them forever. US knew we couldn't do that in 2001. So there was no intention to stay in Afghanistan forever. However, that is one extreme. The other extreme, I think, is that US also did not want to cut and run. So the question is, what is the middle way? I think the middle way was the US trying to say, look, let's help this country build institutions. Let's help them develop their democratic tenets, their democratic principles. Let us help them build their army. And the US poured money, poured the resources into it. 300,000 Afghan soldiers were trained across the panoply of the armed forces regime, were trained to be able to withstand, the Taliban. But as I said, the big question is whether you can buy the will to fight. So for me, the poignant question was the speed with which the country army or the country armed forces cave in. I wouldn't know. But that raises the question whether we don't have another model we should contemplate. That model, to be honest with you, I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball to it. Should the US have left in 2010, 2011 when they took out Osama bin Laden? I don't think so, because I don't think at that point in time, US had actually decimated Al-Qaeda. What US had done then was to scatter Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda withdrew. Al-Qaeda decided to wait out the US. They knew US would leave eventually. Al-Qaeda, Taliban knew the US would leave eventually. They've been in the game for a long time. That is the life that most of them grew up to know. So the truth is, nobody has a clear-cut answer. And that was why I was suggesting earlier on that for me, what could have happened, the role that international law could have played through the Security Council will be for them to have realized from 2001 that one day US and its allies will leave Afghanistan. And if that would happen, there was likely to be a collapse of the system or some kind of tension. Would there be a gap between when the allied forces depart and when a new government takes place, or when we are sure that the Afghan army will be up to the task? We did not follow that path. Rather, the path that was followed was that we will stay there and train the government and train them in democracy and train Afghans in how to police, how to defend their countries against the Taliban. I think that was utterly naive, as we have now learned. Of course, I am not merely talking in hindsight here. People have written load on the fact that the end game for Taliban is that they will wait out the US and they will strike when the US departed. And that was what happened eventually. So it's not as if we are talking with hindsight here. We knew this was going to happen. And that also should call into question the sincerity of the application of international collective security system in certain places. If you go to what happened in Bosnia, we had Dayton Accord. We had comprehensive treaties that made sure that the crisis that happened in the backyard of Europe will never happen again. Why can't we replicate that in Afghanistan? Why can't we replicate that in other parts of the world? Why didn't we replicate that in Sierra Leone and Liberia? If ECOWAS did not go to Sierra Leone and Liberia, the story will have pretty much looked like what happened in Afghanistan. So for me, I think we should start realizing the fact that we cannot really hope in 21st century that a heavily political and politicized Security Council holds the key to an effective implementation of international law and collective security system anywhere in the world other than in countries where members of the Security Council, permanent members of the Security Council, have abiding interest in that. And I think for me, that is the reality.
Yes, thank you very much again for that explanation, Professor. Now, I would like to turn my attention to Madam Vasanta. And now, since if we are to say that the Security Council is not going to be capable or it is going to be delayed in achieving something, would it be a case or would it be a justification? Can we argue that in case now, since there are a lot of people who have texted in the chat box that humanitarian atrocities could be committed in Afghanistan. So humanitarian intervention in such kind of a situation, we know that it is a controversial area, but could it be justified in such kind of a situation where humanitarian issues are going to be escalated? Madam?
Yes, Akalanka, and actually, I think Professor Abbas very lucidly explained about the UN collective security regime and where the deadlocks prevail in terms of the powers and functions of the Security Council. You know, what we should understand is that this UN Charter, when it was established in 1945, that I think that was a kind of a determination to establish international peace, harmony, and stability across the globe, and to avoid any third world war was happening. So always, as Professor Abbas very correctly said, we are trying to find out where the UN has gone wrong, but we are not trying to find out where the UN has gone right. Because if the Security Council powers, I mean, despite the fact that still that we need to, constantly try to achieve international rule of law, international democracy at the UN level, because we know these 5 veto holding countries, the way that they behave, that is not what has been or what have been perceived at the time of those Dambarnak proposals that were the place where the UN Charter was drafted. So the drafters of the UN Charter would not have perceived the way the so-called superpowers, 5 veto holding countries are divided based on their strategic purposes, geopolitical reasons, and with the purposes of supporting to their allies. However, despite all these things, that we should identify some of the good things are happening. If you take for an example with regard to the question that you asked, Akalanka, take Article 2 of the UN Charter, particularly Article 2, Paragraph 4, which is, I believe, as one of the cornerstone principles of international law, because it says invasionary wars are prohibited, particularly no state in their international relation should use threat or actual use of force against political independence or territorial integrity of a state. So to guarantee this very important bedrock principle of international law, we find the rest of the principles, provisions of the UN Charter are formulated. That is where Article 51 comes in as a very exceptional provision, as well as Chapter 7 as very exceptional chapter. Only based on those 2 exceptions, there could be certain amount of use of force in order to, achieve right to self-defense. That could be by one individual state or the collective self-defense by a collection of states in the name of the protection. On the other hand, Security Council is vested on all these powers. I mean, again, like going from a ladder, climbing one step to another, beginning from Pacific settlement of dispute settlement, commencing from Article 33, negotiations, mediation, conciliation, arbitration, quasi-judicial remedies, then judicial remedies. If everything you will go unsuccessful, only that the next level will happen under Article under Chapter 7. So again, that also has to be started from Article 41, 42, commencing from the economic sanctions, communication sanctions, diplomatic, withdrawal of diplomatic relations. And failing of all these things, only the use of force can be used. So when we are talking about humanitarian interventions, what does these humanitarian interventions actually mean? So the word humanitarian is very impressive, but it is the outer cover. Based on covering using the word humanitarianism, what will come? That is the use of force. So armed interventions happened in 1990s. For an example, in Bosnia, in Belgrade or wherever. In Rwanda, very lately, in Iraq, again, Afghanistan is one of the classic examples, later on in Libya. Now what is happening in Syria? All these things remind us that humanitarian intervention is not that as innocent as that we think. So another problem is, now this humanitarian intervention, when is used by one state or collective of states, it could be NATO or any other such regional kind of arrangements, right? So that also will bring a different version of disaster. They are not engaged in meditation program or any other kind of a very innocent package there. So they are going to use the bombs, they are going to use the arms, they are going to use the power, the terror. So what happens is the civilians will be affected, children and women will be affected. The many people will lose their lives. The economy will be affected. International relations will be affected. So using humanitarian intervention could be one of the last resorts, as well as it should be properly controlled and subject to very strict limitations to identify the genuine intention behind the humanitarian. Now we find most of the pretextual humanitarian interventions. The humanitarian is the pretext, or that is used to shield the ulterior motives. As Professor Adimola said, how can we expect every day, every year, every decade, the foreign army to be in a foreign territory, invest in trillions or billions of dollars? I remember that when during the early passage of US-led military presence in Afghanistan, even in Iraq, many US soldiers died out of that hostilities, and many parents, mothers of those soldiers, they made the cover or the profile of then President George Bush. He was portrayed by using the photographs of those killed soldiers who were from American army. The mothers were asking from American president and from the entire world, why our sons should die for something happening in Afghanistan or in Iraq. So these are some of the compelling things. So humanitarian intervention should be the last resort. Now, I think after the 2001 attack, September 11 attack, Canadian government sponsored very important international commission, that is International Commission on State Sovereignty and International Intervention. So they wanted to craft a new principle, that is what we know as responsibility to protect, R2P. So responsibility to protect shared the responsibility between two actors. One is with the domestic authorities, and that is the primary responsibility. So I mean, the very first responsibility always should be given to the domestic authorities. Now, as Professor said, now whether we like it or not, we have to understand the fact. Now, this is their government. The government is in exile. President Ghani left the country. Some say that he has gone to Tajikistan. We don't know where he is in. We don't know whether he will form a government living in exile. However, now Talibanis have come into the Kabul, and they will form their government somehow or the other. So then we know that is the factual situation. We have to recognize the factual situation. Many states will come forward to recognize the factual situation. If not, they will legally accept the situation. But if Talibanis are strategic enough to do something more than that the international community and the rest of the communities, even the citizens of Afghan people are scared of. So if they are trying to do something, eventually they will be able to garner even international support and even de jure recognition. So to that stance, they should be pushed, not what that we should need to intervene once again. However, failing in which all these primary responsibility to be given to the authorities in the form of a de facto manner or even a de jure manner. So failing in which only the international community should undertake the residual responsibility under the responsibility to protect. Again, this responsibility to protect comes as the alternative for the humanitarian intervention. Also have some other tiers: responsibility to prevent, responsibility to intervene, as well as responsibility to rebuild. So first thing that the international community should try to do is to prevent the adverse complications to happen. So it could come in many respects. We don't know. The situation is still going on. We cannot have a very good forecast of what will happen. Our foreseeability is limited right now, but we should try to prevent what is escalating. The international pressure, the international and regional organizations, neighboring states. I saw some of the chats. The SARC is crippled. We know these very handful of SARC countries cannot be united. We cannot bring even India and Pakistan into one platform. So how are we going to expect SARC to intervene that this matter happens in SARC region? And when it comes to the regional level organizations like European Union or African Organization for African Unity, we don't have such a powerful Asian organization. So this is where the Asian countries should get together. But it is very highly unlikely. We know the tensions as well as the politics between India and China. So all these countries will try to fish in the troubled waters. So they will try to see what share that they can exploit from this troubled situation. So in that respect, I think now more than intervention in the name of humanitarianism, so such a humanitarian intervention will not be a genuine intervention in the most of the occasions. So I think that is the international pressure that can exert on Afghanistan and Taliban if they to be recognized as in at least a de facto government, eventually to extend as a de jure, because now this is a collapsed country. I don't think they have enough economic resources and other things to rebuild the country. Under responsibility to protect, one of the responsibilities is to rebuild. So I don't think since the dawn of this millennium, I mean, many tangible things could be brought in by the interim government. So now Talibanis, they want to sustain at least their power. For that, at least they have to do something provable as to be acceptable by some of the countries that to be connected with them to go forward. So that space has to be exploited. So that pressure has to be there. Some conditions has to be there. So those kind of practical measures will help. But I don't think this humanitarian intervention comes in the name of humanitarianism. But again, a kind of another military intervention will not be a permanent solution to the situation. But it might be at another stage if all these other steps will go in fail.
Thank you so much, madam, for that as well. So we can see that even though that we are very much excited and anxious about what are the things that can be done, but still we need to be patient. And because that is how actually international law works as well. Because when we think about the core concepts of sovereignty and self-determination, we have to respect what is happening internally within Afghanistan, and then as the rest of the world, we also have to look into what are the ramifications that it might have on us. So Professor Ademola, can you explain as to what are the ramifications that it may have on the other regions, particularly maybe regarding Africa or other countries where such troubles are existing? So again, Professor, you can unmute.
Thank you very much, Noah. That's a very interesting question about what kind of, what does this portend for other regions? Well, I mean, for Southeast Asia, for that part of the world, Professor has already spoken about the dynamics, bringing some key players in Southeast Asia together, Pakistan and India, because of their own, intra-wangling. They don't like it to say eye to eye on that. Again, they have different different approaches to dealing with Afghanistan. Maybe more Pakistan than India, because of the history of Al-Qaeda proliferation, also Taliban crisscrossing between the two countries. But Africa, well, Europe, let me say, I don't know what impact in regions like Europe. It's a very interesting question, because one of the things I was thinking about earlier on was, if we say Security Council is deeply politicized, as we know today, and I'm happy Professor just spoke extensively on why international humanitarian intervention is not going to work. In very few occasions in international law, have we really seen a true case, or have we seen true cases of humanitarian intervention? And that is because, of self-interest that dominated. Remember 1983, when United States went to Grenada on the pretext that the life of 300 medical students, American medical students in Grenada, was at stake. Eventually, we knew that was not the case. US went in because it wanted to prevent a particular government from coming in. And states in international law are very, very careful to invoke the right of humanitarian intervention. We call it ex deo machinae. It's like the act of God. It's like the machine of God. It is something that states are not very easy to. And the UN, the same thing. Do not forget, you can only undertake humanitarian intervention within a particular state. So you have to balance international law with the sovereign right of a state. And Article 2 of the UN Charter prevents the United Nations from taking any action that, will negate the territorial integrity or sovereignty of any member state. So the UN is very, very careful. And that is why even in instances that United Nations have motivated countries to go into countries to prevent disaster from happening, they have never really coined such activities as humanitarian intervention, because you have to meet a lot of criteria in international law, customary rule of international law, before you can actually say, you are vindicating humanitarian intervention in a country. So when you look at that, and that's why I spoke earlier on about the role of regional organizations. So when you're asking a question about what impact has it got on regions, it will vary. In Africa, Africa has, funny enough, one of the audience, I think, wrote a question when I was talking about why SARAC or ASEAN will not be active in that, and the person said, SARAC is not active. Thank you so much for that, which is true. SARAC is not active. Most regional organizations in Africa and in Asia are not active. But incidentally, you ask yourself, most regional organizations in the Western Hemisphere and Europe, they're very, very active. So today, you and I cannot be worried about what might happen about Afghanistan happening in Europe. No, because European Union will not allow it to happen. They have a very strong regional organization to act there. We might say it won't happen in Latin America today because, after all the crisis of the Allende and Co. in the 80s and 70s and 90s, OAS was able to checkmate a lot of activities there, of course, motivated by the United States itself. So we can say in the Americas, regional organizations has been active. So in Western Hemisphere and in Europe, the impact of what is going on here will be limited on regions. But when you come to Africa, then it's a chicken and egg situation, because on the one hand, Africa actually has some relatively effective regional organizations. I spoke about ECOWAS earlier on. In the scheme of things, ECOWAS was able to vindicate, give or take, humanitarian intervention in Liberia and in Sierra Leone. I mean, if you remember, when ECOWAS was going to Liberia, it said loud and I quote that we are going to Liberia to stop the senseless killing in that country. That was a toga of of humanitarian intervention. And the same thing when it went to Sierra Leone. But ECOWAS was funded mostly by Nigeria and also by the Western countries at the end of the day. Eventually, when ECOWAS stabilized, Sierra Leone, United Nations system came in. But the impact of the disaster in Liberia and Sierra Leone racked a lot in West Africa at that point in time, which was what motivated, those Nigeria and other countries to go into Liberia and Sierra Leone. Now, the impact of Afghanistan is going to reverberate in West Africa, in Asia, and other places, probably outside, apart from Europe, and probably in the Americas. And that is because Africa today has become the hotbed of terrorism. Libya is in turmoil. Nigeria, my country, is going through, crisis because of ISIS and ISWAP. Mali, Gambia, a lot of countries in Africa are going up in places. Now, here is a catch. ISIS in Nigeria, ISWAP in Nigeria, Al-Shabaab in Kenya, and other active organizations are likely to be taking cue from what is going on in Afghanistan today to say, look, if the Taliban could wait the most monstrous power in the world, if they could wait it out for 20 years, we have all the time to wait all these small governments in Africa. We can wait them out for the next 5 or 10 years. They will collapse. Now, if Taliban could wait out the US with over 1 trillion naira, over 300,000 Afghan soldiers, over the best troops you can ever get in the world from US and NATO forces, if they could wait them out and achieve what they have achieved, that is a deadly message you are giving to other terrorist organizations in the world, in Africa, in Asia, or wherever that, look, all you have to do is to bide your time. Go back into the bushes, go back into the forest, go into high mountains. Let the West spend this money, come out when the time is right for you. I think the international community, the UN, should learn that lesson fast now, that the implication of what is happening, what has happened and what is happening and what is going to happen in Afghanistan will be devastating, especially, unfortunately, to developing countries. We don't see this happening. UK has the resources to fight terrorism from now until the end of the world. US has the resources to fight. When they buckle down in their own countries, they've got the resources to fight the terrorists. It is the countries in the third world that will suffer a lot in this. And that is why, to my mind, I think, and I hear the professor loud and clear when she was speaking, I know there is a problem getting certain countries together, you know, in Southeast Asia. But this is where it is very important for countries to come together and say, look, at the end of the day, if we allow foreign countries to come into our country, they can spend billions of dollars. They can even spend trillions of dollars. They can never buy the will to fight. We must come together as countries in that particular region to be able to have an effective means of checking ourselves. Look, I worked for African Union in the past, and I used to be very critical of that organization because of its ineffectiveness. But for better or for worse, at least African Union is still a rallying point. It's a rallying point for a lot of African countries. And for better or for worse, African Union does take some actions against its errant member states. You know, so we have a lot of problems in Africa today in countries and this and that, but many countries are finding out in Africa that overthrowing a democratic government is no longer a norm. It's no longer in fashion. Nobody is happy about that anymore. Because one of the commentators here said that, well, there was an overthrow of a democratic government in Afghanistan. Shouldn't that be the basis for the world to go in? No, unfortunately, it was some Afghans who have overthrown a government by Afghans. It's an internal matter. The Security Council cannot go in and say, because you've blown out a democratic government, we are going to blow you out. No, that is not the job of international law. International law cannot dictate to a country the kind of government it's going to run. So the fact that the Taliban came in through the use of force, you know, doesn't change the equation. And in any case, to be really actually factual, they did not shoot their way into power. The government capitulated and said it wanted to prevent a bloodshed. But even if Taliban had used force against the government of Ghana in Afghanistan, that would never even have justified intervention by the international community, because that would have been purely an internal matter for Afghanistan, except if during the use of force by the Taliban, there was massive violation of human rights that constitute a threat to international peace and security under Article 39 of the UN Charter. If that happens to be the case, then the Security Council will make that determination and then will authorize an action under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, and then can then authorize that measures under Article 31, Article 41 or 42, or if we come to shave, Article 43 should be deployed. But that is not the situation we are faced with here. We are faced with a situation in which a group of Afghans called Taliban, the Taliban, you know, threatened and overthrew, if you want to call it that, a government of Afghan people. So it's a purely internal matter. And I can say for a fact, UN is not going to come in, no. So the impact of the activities of that will ricochet a lot in that region and in the third world. I think it's high time somebody began to talk to the General Assembly that it's high time that the third world countries in General Assembly of the UN started focusing on how to strengthen their regional organizations. When push comes to shove, the Security Council is dominated and is driven by the interests of its most powerful members. It is not likely to go into countries where the interest of those members is not at stake. We saw it in Rwanda. We saw it in Kosovo. We saw it in Sierra Leone. We saw it in other places. We are still going to see it. So we should start building the capacity of region, because between international organizations such as UN and individual states, the stopgap is regional organizations. And if you drill down, then you have the sub-regional organizations. Look at Arab League in those days. Arab League, many of us don't know that Arab League actually wasn't existent before the UN itself was founded. It is the inability of powerful members of such regional organizations that make them to be completely useless at the end of the day. We faced that in ECOWAS until Nigeria stood up and say in 1997 and say, you know what, we're not going to allow this to happen to ourselves. Of course, Nigeria had a hegemonic interest in doing that, but the truth is, at least it deployed its resources, both financial and material, in ECOMOG to be able to stave that off. NATO went to Libya in 2011, decimated Gaddafi, ended the war, and then left. What was ripped in Libya at the end of the day is a total mess. Libya, 10 years after, is in an utmost mess today. And that is why I said earlier on, and I'll repeat, that it's only regions, only states in that particular region can come together and find an abiding solution to the crisis in Afghanistan and in any country for that matter of such nature. I'm not saying discard the international community, no. The UN is there, the UN is powerful, and as I said, and the person also reiterated, the UN has so many relevancies that we overlook. International law has so many successes that we overlook. But in the most critical part of international law that the UN exists for, which is so that, as the preamble of the United Nations says, so that that war, which has twice in our lifetime beaten us, shall not happen again. It is going to happen again. It is already happening, only on a smaller scale in individual countries. What the UN Charter was focusing on was to prevent the Third World War. There are miniatures of Third World War happening in individual countries, but they are not at the scale that would galvanize the interest of the United Nations system. Until you see the US attacking the UK, until you see France attacking China, until you see Russia attacking Australia, you are not likely to get a decent agreement on collective security machinery of the UN effective under Chapter 7 as we have it today.
Yes, Professor, thank you so much for that. Again, well, I look at the time. Actually, we are supposed to end it within another 13 minutes, but I don't think we can do that. But I hope with the permission of Professor Ademola that we can continue for a little while. So now I would like to open the floor for our kind participants. Like, I know that they have been eagerly waiting. They can raise their questions. And in the meantime, I would like to humbly request you to raise your hands if you do have a question that we can allow the floor. And in the meantime, I would also like to invite Air Marshal Gagana Bulaksinghale, who has actually served in Afghanistan, to share his thoughts as well. Sir, if you are here.
Thank you, Professor, for your lovely insights into this ongoing, I would say, in parallel to the pandemic, which is going on right now, unfolding in our region, and also Madam Vasanta, for your lovely insights. I was in Afghanistan from 2017 to end 2019 as Sri Lankan ambassador in Afghanistan. So during that period, nearly about 3 years, we had lots of things happening in Afghanistan. So what we see now is the culmination of that. And as the diplomatic community, we saw things that were unfolding little by little. And it's very unfortunate that initially the first incident took place on the 6th of the first province falling apart. And in a very short span, the whole country collapsed and they were able to walk into Kabul. The good side is we did not see much bloodshed when they walked into Kabul. I think that's a blessing when you see from the humanitarian side. However, right now the question is, I think, other than for China and for Russia, all other diplomatic missions and the UN, all the other diplomatic missions have virtually suspended their operations in Afghanistan. So we need to look at how things are unfolding. And former President Hamid Karzai and Dr. Abdullah, who was the former chief executive and also head of the peace delegation, they are in communication with the Haqqani as well as the Taliban network. I think that's a very good thing, very positive thing. They coming to the table to discuss these things. The other positive factor that I have seen is we have not seen any destruction or any killings in the capital. Maybe there would have been any isolated incidents, but however, by and large, it has been very peaceful, I would say, transition. So there had not been resistance from the public as well as from the Taliban side. They have not shown much aggression to any other public. So I think when you take the Afghan people, they have been squeezed, I would say, for the last 20 years in this dilemma, and they were very happy, especially in Kabul. One concern that most of them are uncomfortable with is what's going to be the women's freedom or the liberties that they enjoy. Right now, they say that they could work, and it's not the burqa that is need to be with the hijab. They could work, but still we don't get any official intimation on that. And also during on this humanitarian crisis, because when you see those photographs where some of the poor Afghans falling off the aircraft, that shows their desperation for them to leave that situation. So maybe they have their own reasons, and probably if you take a 20-year-old kid who was enjoying the denims and the Western fancy clothes, have to get into the local attire. So those are the things that are coming across. But as at now, I think we'll have to wait and see how things unfold within the next week or so, because to see what things are happening. As all of you, the lady and you explained, UN still remains in Kabul. So they are also waiting to see, and with the G5, and it is we are yet to see how it could be divided, because Russia and China are taking a stance of supportive. They are not directly saying so, but they are supportive on this situation, and especially China with their 76 kilometer border bordering them. And the other side of the border, China has the separatist movement where there is predominantly it's the Muslims. So I'm pretty sure prelude to this, I think, if I'm not mistaken, on 28th of July, Taliban delegation went across to Beijing, which was not normal because they only had all the meetings in Doha, Qatar, but they went so. So I'm sure they would have, there must be some things happening behind the scenes that we still yet we are not privy to. But we need to wait and see how things evolve. But I feel very sorry for the Afghan people, because they're very humble people, and their poverty levels are not that great. And all have come to Kabul for employment opportunities, because they don't have it much in the provinces. So that is why all these people are there in Kabul. So that is my take right now. And if there is any questions, I'm willing to take it from here onwards. Thank you, Professor, and thank you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, sir, for that your on-hand experience living there. So now the floor is open for any questions. You may raise them. You can directly ask them, or you can also drop them in the chat box as well. So any questions? Now we will entertain.
I think Mr. Akalanka, already some questions are posted in the chat box. I hope that both of us have managed to address some of those concerns. But I find certain questions are about what would be the impact of the situation in Afghanistan to Sri Lanka and the regional security. Although that we attempted to discuss some aspects of it, I think you know, this is a rebel group, you know, that they were waiting to come into power for so long. This will sometime, this is my personal reading of the situation, this may give a kind of a inspiration to some of those similar rebel groups in some of the countries. I mean, frankly speaking, even in Sri Lanka, we had to face with the secessionist movement. So those sort of happening in the region sometimes will give a kind of a thrust for those rebel movements. They might have a kind of a motivation, well, we too can achieve some of the things. So that risk is there in one place. Another thing is that the spill over effect from over the borders. Already the people who are trying to flee, as I'm very thankful to Mr. Air Chief Marshal, Mr. Gagan Bulat Sinhala, who shared with us his first-hand experience. It's really, really important. So they could have different reasons, you know, people might take on from different perspectives. Some Afghans may like it, some Afghans may not like it, you know, the way that they are trying to say. Even some people like fundamentalist, you know, some people like liberal perspectives, you know, so things are there. So with all that, these tensions, as well as trying to flee from those countries, we saw the way that people were hanging on aircrafts and trying to flee. So this will be a mass exodus of refugee flees from Afghanistan into the neighboring state. We know what happened in Myanmar and how already Bangladesh and many other countries are affected by that. This burden sharing has a kind of a limit, you know. When Sri Lanka was having the hardest time of our war, we know how Sri Lankans fled from the country to neighboring states and to Europe. So the burden sharing, now international community, the countries have their own problems, especially during this pandemic period. Each and every country, I don't think even the well-developed countries are without any problems. So they are trying to cater the needs of their own citizens. So at the same time, if they have to entertain and to accept those exodus of people, so that is going to be a big problem to the stability in the region. Pakistan on one side, China on the other side, you know, likewise, Tajikistan and many states neighboring. So we cannot say, well, that Sri Lanka will be immune from all these things. You know, everything will have more or less impact on the countries in the region. I mean, Sri Lanka is hardly affected by COVID. Also, you know, that there are problems to our economy. So these kind of instability in the region, economic crisis in the region, security threats in the region definitely will have a very dreadful effect, if you like it or not. I mean, those things would be, you know, unavoidable. Yes, I just thought to share those thoughts before that we will receive any further questions, as I saw some of the chats in the chat room.
Yes, thank you, Professor. I saw some of the questions. Somebody raised a very interesting one here, talking about, you know, whether that international law has nothing to do with everything, comes with terrorism. That you know, that look, I understand it is very easy for us to be cynical of international law, especially, you know, in this kind of environment. But we must understand one thing. There is political foundation for international law. International law, don't let's forget, is not a law that the Sri Lankan parliament or Nigerian parliament or US Congress, anybody sit down to legislate for their people. We all know how international law evolves. It's basically mostly from customs that states agree, then to codify, to begin to bind on them. And we still remember Vienna Convention of Law of Treaties and consular relations, how all these things evolve from, you know, practices and custom of. That means that international law, unfortunately, doesn't work to the same speed or effectiveness that we will have wanted it, or that that domestic law counterpart will work. But that doesn't mean that international law does not work. It works most times. As I said, so it's easy in this kind of environment for us to actually get a bit cynical about it. Even though US went into Afghanistan on the basis of decimating terrorism, it still had to underline its action in international law. It didn't throw away the UN Charter. he called his allies together. He said, look, we have a right under Article 51 of the UN Charter. And apart from that, we have also a right under Article 5 of NATO Treaty of 1940 to be able to go into Afghanistan and do what they did. Now, another question is whether, it took 20 years and 32 governors or 4 presidents to realize that it was a mess. Something tells me that the US did not anticipate that this is how this will end. And I think we need to probably be a bit more charitable when probably we take all this on board. Because short of having a crystal ball, it will be difficult in 2001. And I will imagine that it will be almost hard to believe that you could gladly go and pour $1 trillion, 20 years down the drain, thousands of your own citizens, if you are guaranteed that the outcome will be what we saw a few days ago. I wouldn't think so, And the fact that Security Council has not been able to actually do what we might think it should do is interpretable in international law context. There are rules and regulations. We cannot say simply because Taliban stood up and sacked a government, even though they didn't fire a gun at that particular government, and sacked the government. So the UN, we don't want to move from one act of incorrigibility and go into another one. We don't want an unbridled United Nations system. We don't want a UN system that will just find any pretext to go into a country, into a territory of its member state, then to begin to use force. So we have to be careful in finding a balance, a savvy balance between making sure that we protect human lives in a country and also about to be sure at that point, at the same time, that we do not throw away international law cautions in the process. I think that is very, very important. So I will not go, why I understand the frustration that is behind that question, that look, US tried to change the world order for 20 years and so on and so forth. I understand that, but I wouldn't automatically, run to the conclusion that so therefore international law has nothing to do when everything counts with terrorism. No, I think that would be a little bit hard, a bit too harsh on international law. Let's understand international law from a legal system that is based mainly fundamentally on consent of states. When your parliament in our different countries make law, they don't come to me and say, Demola, I want to apply this law to you. The Sri Lankan parliament, when it makes law in Sri Lanka, doesn't call everybody. It doesn't say, no, I'm going to apply this law to you. No, they make the law and they apply it. But when states agree to international law, they must still give their consent for it to be applied to them. Don't let's forget the consent, the role that consent plays in the application of international law. And that is very, very important for us to. And His Excellency, the former ambassador of Sri Lanka to Afghanistan, thank you so much for that insight. I mean, that was remarkable, because as I said, there is no substitute for first-hand experience. And the one you shared with us, I think, brought certain things into light. As you've said, it's a waiting game. The UN is waiting. Everybody else is waiting. And that ties into the question one of the participants asked, that what would be the role of China in this? Look, it's anybody's guess. But if the role of China in post-conflict African states is anything to go by, then I dare say China is going to outpace everybody in getting to grip with Afghanistan. I would not be surprised if China will not be doing serious deals with that country now. Don't forget, when a country goes through a conflict, they need infrastructure that have been decimated. They need to rebuild. They need to create jobs for their people. And typically, Western world is going to come down to Afghanistan and tell Afghan people that we are going to support Taliban, we're going to support you based on your human rights record. They're going to make human rights as a condition for giving aid. Now, people in Afghanistan are going to be caught in this web of they need their infrastructure to be rebuilt, hotels to be rebuilt, tourism to be rebuilt, they need jobs to be created, they need money to do that, which they haven't got. Then you have Western countries saying, you know what, we need to see we need to be sure that human rights will be respected before we can do this, which they should do. Don't get me wrong, we must respect human rights. But the question is whether you make it a condition before you give necessary support to people in dire need of your support. It's another question. And that is how China has managed to corner the rest of the world, basically. After 17 years of brutal war, Sierra Leone and Liberia came out and were in dire need of resources to build their infrastructure. The last thing they wanted to listen to was countries like UK telling them human rights, we need to see human rights. When it was companies from those countries like UK, for instance, like Sign Lines in the UK, a company that in the first place armed the locals, the local militia in those two countries to kill themselves. They don't want to listen to such countries and come and lecture them on human rights. Please, I'm not saying throw human rights to the bin. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying we must strike a realistic balance between the need to ensure that the Taliban protect and they respect the right of the Afghan people, and also of saying we want to support them, give them the resources that they need to rebuild their economy, to rebuild their country. And it is in that particular space that I see China being more proactive and more generous and more understanding of the problem of the Afghans than probably most of the Western world.
Thank you so much, Professor. And now I think we can entertain, I think maybe the last question. Then Major Siran Mendis has a question. He has raised his hand. Yes.
Yes, Akalanga, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. My question was to Air Chief Marshal Gagana Bulat sir. Sir, Sri Lanka, we have faced 3 decades of civil conflict with a terrorist organization, and Sri Lankan forces have managed to end that civil conflict. And up to now, we are in a peaceful situation. And my question is, what has gone wrong with the Afghan armed forces comparing to our forces?
Yes, I hope I think there might be some kind of a technical issue there. If Air Marshal Gagan Bulak Sinhala, yes, I think he is now here. Okay.
Yes, can you say again the question? Yes, there was a small technical glitch. My apologies. Can you repeat it, please, Major?
Yeah, sir, Sri Lanka, we have faced 3 decades of civil conflict with the terrorist organization, and Sri Lankan forces has managed to end that civil conflict, and up to now we are in a peaceful situation. And my question is, what has gone wrong with the Afghan armed forces comparing to our forces?
Well, actually, Afghan armed forces, it's a very sizable force. Now they have built it, I think it's 300,000 plus. But the thing is, one area in Afghanistan is their culture is so, they are very ethnically divided, and also they are inclined to their tribe and the clan, though they still remain in the army. And the second thing is, over a period of time, though they have been inducted into it, their morale, when I was there also, I found that it was very low. So I would say now when these people walked in, there was no response from them, at least to respond by firing or something, because they were happy that Taliban was coming, as Mrs. Vasanta was telling. They have very mixed feelings, especially because of the political situation in that country. Because you know that they had a presidential election, 2 presidential elections after President Karzai, then President Ghani, and again President Ghani. But all those elections were with mixed reaction, and it was in abeyance for a long time to declare the results. So that made all the people, the public as well as the military, they were like virtually they were not interested in any of these things. So I think that dropped the morale, and also because it's a very, very, the rural areas and the provinces are far away. They lost that control that was there, because if you go back recently, some of you may be knowing, the chief of the army was replaced. And also, you must understand that they were well equipped and armed by the US and the NATO forces, whereas the Air Force was equipped very well. So right now, that is also an issue where people are questioning, because they have a big arsenal of inventory of aircraft as well as combat capability in the air, and how it would be managed by the Taliban. So answering short to your question, in our scenario, the political leadership as well as the military leadership kept our forces very much in high morale, and they kept them motivated. And that was great. The leadership was really great within our system, that kept our forces very much intact. I think that is the main difference between the two countries if you compare and contrast the two situations. I don't know whether I have answered you, and I will share my email. You can communicate with me further if you need any further clarifications.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Right. So now I think we are running out of schedule as well. I think, well, I mean, there is a saying, I hope that Professor and Madam can come in. Yes. Now, I mean, in any kind of, thank you speech, we say like the wheels start rolling some time back. Actually, they did, maybe for a few years. But it was only yesterday that I contacted Professor Ademola, and luckily he was in UK and he had some spare time, and he said, okay, we will do it. So on such short notice, I think I think by this time yesterday we were preparing the flyer. And with that, I think, first of all, I have to apologize as well, because there might have been some participants who would not have joined, because there were more than 548 registered participants. And unfortunately, even if we had a maximum Zoom account, still we would have been only able to accommodate around 500. So this really shows the interest that everyone has on such kind of a topic. And also, again, I was going to quote from Professor Ademola's book itself, where international law is always, it is always blamed for what it has not achieved instead of what it has actually achieved. And for that, we are always grateful. And long gone are the days when we were arguing whether international law is really law or not. We all agree here that it is law. And this discussion itself really shows that we do care about international law, that we want it to protect us. Maybe it might not do it the same way we expect it. Maybe the objectives of international law might be different than what we think or what we may perceive, but still it is relevant, and it is going to be more relevant in the future. And for this, I don't have words to thank Professor Ademola for accepting coming here and spending more time than what was initially planned, and giving a great talk on this contemporary issue. While it was hot, I think this might be the first discussion that the Sri Lankan Forum has had on this issue on the fall of Kabul. And for that, we have to thank, in particular, again, Professor Ademola for coming here, and then again, my mentor, and the one who showed me the way and still is Madam Vasanta. I use that term, Madam Vasanta, again. And also, though could not join with us today, Dr. Sampath Punchihewa, the Dean of the Faculty, who gave a straight okay when we proposed this idea. And also the participants who took the interest and came here, stayed till now. It's 9:45, like 9:46 actually. Now still we are having 95 participants, and I think this really showcases the interest, the enthusiasm, and everything that we have about international law. And I really do hope that we can arrange these kind of discussions in the future. And with that, hoping for the best, to be protected from the virus and not to be infected with it. And with that, I should also conclude my what you call vote of thanks, almost, maybe very much informal, but it was a great experience for all of us. And I hope to meet you once again with such kind of a forum. And also just one thing, if you have further questions, and Professor Adimol has been very much kind enough to share his email address and his WhatsApp number as well, you can always contact him. And this video will be uploaded to the YouTube channel so that anyone who missed it today can easily go there and watch it. So with that, I conclude. Good night and be safe. Thank you so much.
Thank you.